Welcome to What If Sleepstorian, where What If whispers timeless tales into dreams. Breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and drift into tonight's gentle story. What if, beneath glass spires and echoing arches, secrets stirred in silence, traced only by those who listened closely to the quiet hum of curiosity? So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. In the hushed embrace of a London evening, where autumn mist clung to the cobblestones like gentle fingers, the great Crystal Palace stood sentinel against the darkening sky. Its iron ribs gleamed silver in the gaslight, each pane of glass catching and holding the last whispers of daylight before releasing them into the soft darkness. The year was 1887, and the palace had found its second home in Sydenham, rising from manicured grounds like a cathedral of light and air, a temple to human ingenuity that breathed with the quiet rhythm of the evening wind. The air around the palace carried the scent of autumn leaves, damp earth, and the faint metallic tang of iron that had weathered London's countless seasons. Inside those translucent walls, treasures from across the empire rested in their cases, each artifact a story waiting to be told, each display a window into distant worlds. But tonight, something else lingered in the air, a sense of anticipation, of mystery that moved like smoke through the vast corridors, invisible yet undeniably present. Sherlock Holmes walked these streets with the measured pace of a man lost in thought, his tall, lean figure cutting a familiar silhouette against the amber glow of the street lamps. His sharp eyes, grey as winter morning sky, took in every detail with the precision of a scholar and the intuition of a poet. The fog swirled around his ankles as he approached the great entrance, and in that moment London seemed to hold its breath, waiting for whatever revelation the night might bring. Behind him, the steady footfalls of Dr. John Watson provided a comforting rhythm, like a heartbeat that anchored Holmes to the world of ordinary concerns. Watson's warmer presence balanced his friend's intensity, his medical training evident in the way he observed not just the physical world, but the human elements that Holmes sometimes overlooked in his singular pursuit of logical truth. Together, they formed a partnership that had become legend in the gas-lit streets of London. Two minds working in harmony to illuminate the shadows where crime and mystery love to hide. The Crystal Palace at night was a wonder beyond description. During the day it blazed with sunlight, every surface a mirror for the sky's changing moods. But in the evening hours, when the gas lamps were lit and the exhibitions closed to the public, it transformed into something altogether more mystical. The light from within created patterns on the glass that shifted and danced like aurora, and the iron framework cast intricate shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. It was a place where reality and dream might easily blur, where the Victorian love of progress and innovation met something older, more elemental. The palace had been built originally for the Great Exhibition of 1851, a monument to human achievement and imperial grandeur. But when it was moved to Sydenham and reconstructed on an even grander scale, it had taken on a different character. Here, surrounded by gardens and fountains, it had become less a showcase of industry and more a temple to wonder itself. The building stretched for nearly half a mile, its central transept rising to dizzying heights, its wings extending into the distance like the arms of some benevolent giant embracing all the knowledge and artistry of the civilized world. On this particular evening, the palace held more than its usual complement of mystery. For 7 nights running, items had vanished from the exhibitions, not the sort of common theft that might be expected in any public building, but something far more puzzling. The stolen objects seemed chosen not for their monetary value, but according to some pattern that eluded the conventional mind. Each theft had been more audacious than the last, more impossible to explain by ordinary means. The first theft had been discovered on a Monday morning, when the day guards had found an empty space in the Egyptian collection where a small bronze figurine of Thoth had stood for over 2 years. The god of wisdom and writing, patron of scribes and scholars, had simply vanished without a trace. The case showed no signs of tampering, the lock remained secure, and the surrounding artefacts had been carefully rearranged to create a pleasing aesthetic balance, as if the thief had been more concerned with artistic composition than with concealing the crime. The second theft, discovered Tuesday, had taken a medieval manuscript from the rare books collection. The illuminated text, which described forgotten alchemical processes in languages both Latin and vernacular, had disappeared from a case that required 3 separate keys to open. Again, no damage to the locks, no disturbance to the glass, and again that strange artistic sensibility in the rearrangement of the remaining items. Wednesday brought the loss of a Victorian music box, its delicate mechanism capable of playing a hauntingly beautiful melody that seemed to capture something of the longing and melancholy that lurked beneath the age's confident exterior. Thursday saw the disappearance of a set of ancient Greek mathematical instruments, bronze tools that had once been used to explore the mysteries of geometry and astronomy. Friday's theft involved a collection of medieval church bells, each no larger than a child's hand, whose silver voices had once called the faithful to prayer in some long-forgotten abbey. Saturday brought the vanishing of an ornate Renaissance astrolabe, its intricate brass workings designed to map the movements of the heavens and bring celestial order to earthly confusion. And most recently, on Sunday night, a collection of Tibetan singing bowls had disappeared from the Oriental collection, their bronze surfaces still seeming to vibrate with the memory of ancient chants and meditations. What made these thefts truly extraordinary was not what was taken, but what was left behind. In place of each stolen item, the thief had left a small card bearing an intricate puzzle, not written in ink but etched with such delicate precision that they seemed to have been carved by fairy fingers. These cards bore symbols that seemed to dance before the eyes, geometric patterns that suggested meaning just beyond the reach of understanding, and phrases in languages both ancient and invented that spoke of riddles within riddles. The first card, left where the bronze figurine had rested, bore the image of a labyrinth, its pathways forming a pattern that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Below it, in flowing script that seemed to breathe upon the page, were the words, "Where the first step leads to the last and the last returns to the first, there dwells the guardian of what was lost." The second card showed a tree whose roots and branches formed mirror images, creating a perfect symmetry that suggested infinite reflection. Its message read, "In the space between mirrors, truth wears many faces. Seek the face that shows tomorrow's shadow in yesterday's light." The third card bore the image of a key that seemed to be fashioned from crystallized music, its teeth formed by notes that rose and fell in a visual melody. The accompanying text whispered, "The song of silence holds the loudest secret. Listen with eyes closed to the music that has no sound." The fourth card displayed a geometric figure that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the eye could process, a shape that folded in upon itself in ways that made the mind dizzy. Its cryptic message stated, "In the marriage of earth and sky, the circle learns to square itself, and the square dreams of dancing." The fifth card showed an hourglass whose sands seemed to flow upward as well as down, defying the natural order in a way that suggested time itself might be more flexible than commonly supposed. The words beneath it read, "When tomorrow becomes yesterday without passing through today, the bells will ring for those who have learned to hear silence." The sixth card bore the image of a compass rose, whose points indicated not geographic directions, but seemed to point toward concepts that had no names in any earthly language. Its message was perhaps the most cryptic of all. The traveller who knows his destination will never discover where he was meant to go. True north lies in the country of perhaps. The seventh and most recent card showed what appeared to be a mandala, but one whose pattern seemed to move and shift when observed directly, creating an optical illusion that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The accompanying text read, "In the centre of the wheel that never turns, the sound of one hand clapping echoes through 7 valleys of silence." Holmes studied these cards with the intensity of a monk contemplating sacred texts. He held them up to the gaslight, examined them through his magnifying glass, He even held them close to his ear as if they might whisper their secrets directly to him. The paper was unusual, not the common stock found in London shops, but something with a subtle texture that suggested exotic origins. There was something almost organic about it, as if it had been made not from wood pulp but from some more mysterious material that held memory in its very fibres. The ink, or whatever medium had been used to create the etchings, seemed to capture light in unusual ways, sometimes appearing deep black, other times showing hints of colour that vanished when examined directly. Under Holmes's magnifying glass, the images revealed layers of detail that were invisible to the naked eye, tiny symbols hidden within larger ones, patterns that suggested mathematical relationships of extraordinary complexity. "Most curious, Watson," Holmes murmured as they approached the palace's main entrance, his voice carrying that particular note of engagement that Watson had learned to recognise as the herald of one of his friend's most absorbing cases. "These are not the calling cards of a common thief, but the work of someone who views crime as a form of art, perhaps even philosophy. Someone who steals not for profit, but for the pure joy of creating an intellectual puzzle." Watson nodded, his own mind wrestling with the implications. As a man of science and medicine, he was accustomed to mysteries that could be solved through observation and logical deduction. But these cards suggested something different. A mind that operated according to principles that might lie outside the realm of conventional logic, yet were no less systematic for their unconventionality. The palace's night watchman, a man named Pemberton whose weathered face spoke of decades spent in service to various institutions, greeted them at the entrance with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He was a thin, nervous man in his 60s, with hands that trembled slightly as he unlocked the great doors. His eyes, pale blue and watery, darted constantly to the shadows as if expecting the phantom thief to materialise at any moment. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Pemberton said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been walking these halls for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. The thief moves like smoke, leaves no trace save those confounding cards. It's as if the palace itself has developed a taste for mystery." Pemberton had been on duty during several of the thefts, making his rounds with the mechanical precision of the long habit, his heavy boots echoing through the empty corridors. But on each occasion, he had seen nothing, heard nothing unusual. The thefts had occurred in the spaces between his regular patrols, in those quiet moments when the palace seemed to doze like a great sleeping creature. "Tell me about the sounds," Holmes said as they entered the vast interior. "You must know every creak, every whisper of this building. Have you noticed anything different? Any sounds that don't belong?" The old watchman paused, his weathered features creasing with concentration. "Now that you mention it, sir, there have been, not sounds exactly, but absences of sound. Places where the usual echoes seemed muffled, where my footsteps sounded different than they should, and once or twice I could have sworn I heard music, very faint, like someone humming a tune just at the edge of hearing." The interior of the Crystal Palace at night was a realm of wonder and shadow that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. The gas flames flickered in their ornate fixtures, casting dancing light through the translucent walls and creating patterns that shifted and flowed like living things. The vast space was divided into exhibitions from around the world. Egyptian sarcophagi stood beside Greek sculptures. Medieval armour shared space with Oriental jade, and everywhere the eye looked, treasures from across the centuries and continents created a symphony of human achievement. The building's architecture was itself a marvel that never failed to inspire awe in those who encountered it. The iron framework, painted in elegant cream and gold, soared overhead like the ribcage of some magnificent beast. The glass panels, each one individually fitted and sealed, created walls that seemed to dissolve the boundary between interior and exterior space. During the day, the structure was filled with natural light that made the exhibitions glow like jewels in a vast treasure house. At night, with only gaslight for illumination, it became something entirely different, a palace of shadows and reflections where reality seemed negotiable. But tonight, this temple to progress and discovery held a different energy. The shadows seemed deeper, more purposeful. The silence was not the simple absence of sound, but a presence in itself, pregnant with possibility. Even Watson, not given to fanciful thoughts, found himself glancing over his shoulder as they made their way through the exhibitions, as if the very air were watching them with invisible eyes. Holmes moved through this environment like a predator in his natural habitat, his senses attuned to every nuance of the space. He paused frequently, not to examine the obvious clues, the empty display cases, the placement of the puzzle cards, but to absorb the subtler messages that the palace might be trying to communicate. He touched the glass of the cases with his fingertips, feeling for vibrations that might indicate how they had been opened. He knelt to examine the wooden floors for scratches, dust patterns, any sign of unusual activity. The floors themselves told stories. The main thoroughfares showed the wear patterns of countless visitors, their footsteps having polished the wood to a warm glow over the decades. But in the quieter alcoves and side galleries, Holmes could read the more subtle traces left by those who moved through the palace with different purposes. Here, the scuff mark of a maintenance worker's ladder. There, the circular stain where a potted plant had once stood. And in several locations, marks so faint they were almost invisible. Patterns that suggested someone had spent considerable time in those spots, perhaps studying the exhibitions with unusual intensity. "The thief knows this place intimately," Holmes observed, his voice echoing softly in the vast space. "See how the stolen items were chosen. Not randomly, but according to some principle that connects them across cultures and centuries. The bronze figurine, the manuscript, the music box, the mathematical instruments, the bells, the astrolabe, the singing bowls. There's a thread that binds them, Watson, a logic that we have yet to perceive." As they moved deeper into the palace, past displays of Roman coins and Renaissance paintings, past cabinets of curiosities that sparkled like trapped stars, the building itself seemed to respond to their presence. The glass walls caught and multiplied their images, creating a hall of mirrors effect that made it seem as if dozens of Holmes and Watsons were conducting the investigation simultaneously. The iron framework above their heads groaned softly as the structure adjusted to the cooling night air, and these sounds created an almost musical accompaniment to their explorations. The Egyptian collection occupied a section of the palace that had been designed to evoke the mysterious atmosphere of ancient temples. Artificial columns, painted to resemble weathered stone, supported display cases that held treasures that had once rested in the tombs of pharaohs. The lighting here was deliberately dim, creating pools of amber radiance that made the artifacts seem to glow with their own inner fire. They paused at the first crime scene, the display case that had housed the bronze figurine of Thoth. The case showed no signs of forced entry, no scratches on the lock, no cracks in the glass. The lock mechanism was a modern marvel, designed by one of London's finest locksmiths to be virtually impossible to pick. Yet somehow, the thief had opened it as easily as if it had been secured with nothing more than a ribbon. Holmes examined the empty space where the figurine had stood, noting the precise shape left in the velvet display cloth, the way the other artifacts had been carefully rearranged to disguise the theft until the morning guards had made their discovery. This was not the work of someone desperate or hurried, but of an individual who took genuine pleasure in the craft of the crime itself. The figurine had been a masterpiece of ancient bronze working, depicting Thoth with his characteristic ibis head, holding a reed pen and a palette for writing. According to the museum's records, it had been discovered in a tomb near Thebes, along with a collection of papyri that suggested the deceased had been a scribe of unusual learning. The figurine's eyes had been inlaid with precious stones that seemed to hold intelligence, as if the god of wisdom were truly present within the bronze form. "Look here, Watson," Holmes said, pointing to the fabric lining of the case. "See how the surrounding pieces have been shifted to create a kind of balance, an aesthetic arrangement that is actually more pleasing than the original display. Our thief has an eye for composition, a sense of how objects relate to one another in space." The remaining artifacts in the case, a canopic jar decorated with hieroglyphs, a golden scarab beetle, a fragment of painted limestone from a tomb wall, had been repositioned with the skill of a professional curator. The empty space where Thoth had stood was not a gap, but seemed intentional, as if the absence itself had become part of the composition. But more than the artistic sensibility, Holmes noticed something else. The rearrangement had been done according to principles that seemed to relate to the acoustic properties of the display area. The items had been positioned to create specific relationships with the angles of the walls and the height of the ceiling, as if the thief understood how sound would move through this particular space. The second crime scene, in the medieval collection, told a similar story. The manuscript had vanished from a case containing other rare books and documents, but again, the remaining items had been rearranged with an artist's sensibility. The case had originally held 7 manuscripts, their illuminated pages representing centuries of scholarly work by monks and clerics. Now only 6 remained, but they had been repositioned to create a visual harmony that was actually more striking than the original arrangement. The stolen manuscript had been particularly valuable, not for its monetary worth, but for its content. It contained alchemical formulas that predated the better-known works by centuries, written in a mixture of Latin and what appeared to be an invented symbolic language. The margins had been filled with diagrams that showed the relationship between various chemical processes and musical intervals, suggesting that the unknown author had seen connections between the transformation of matter and the harmony of sound. Holmes spent considerable time examining this case, particularly intrigued by the way the remaining manuscripts had been arranged. They formed a pattern that reminded him of musical notation, as if the thief had been composing a visual symphony using books as notes. When he mentioned this observation to Watson, his friend peered more closely at the arrangement and realised that Holmes was quite correct. The heights and positions of the remaining volumes did indeed suggest a melodic line. The third crime scene, where the music box had disappeared from the very heart of the palace, sat beneath the building's great dome. This was the palace's most spectacular architectural feature, a soaring canopy of iron and glass that seemed to capture and concentrate all the building's energy into a single, perfect space. The acoustics here were extraordinary. Sounds seemed to linger, to echo and re-echo until they became something more than mere noise. The music box had been the centrepiece of a display dedicated to mechanical marvels of the Victorian age. Clockwork automata, precision instruments, and ingenious devices that demonstrated the period's fascination with the marriage of art and engineering filled the surrounding cases. The music box itself had been a particularly fine example of the craftsman's art, its case inlaid with precious woods and decorated with scenes of pastoral life. When wounded, it played a melody that seemed to capture something essential about the Victorian spirit, a combination of melancholy and hope, of progress and nostalgia. "Watson," Holmes said slowly, "do you recall the message left with this theft? The song of silence holds the loudest secret. Listen with eyes closed to the music that has no sound." Watson nodded, though he remained puzzled by the cryptic words. "Some sort of philosophical riddle, I assumed, the sort of thing that appeals to minds that prefer obscurity to plain speaking." But Holmes was already closing his eyes, standing perfectly still in the centre of the exhibition space. For several minutes he remained motionless, his breathing slow and regular, his entire being focused on some subtle perception that escaped his companion. Watson waited patiently, long accustomed to his friend's unusual methods, though he found himself growing increasingly aware of the palace's nighttime sounds, the settling of metal, the whisper of wind through the framework, the distant rumble of late trains carrying Londoners home to their beds. When Holmes finally opened his eyes, they held that particular gleam that Watson had learned to associate with breakthrough moments, those instants when seemingly unconnected facts suddenly aligned to reveal their hidden logic. "The palace itself is the instrument, Watson," Holmes said, his voice carrying an excitement that he struggled to contain within the bounds of professional composure. "Listen, do you hear how our voices carry in this space, how they seem to resonate with the structure itself? The music box that was stolen, it wasn't chosen for its value or even its beauty, but for its sound, its relationship to the acoustic properties of this particular location." As if to demonstrate his point, Holmes moved to different positions within the exhibition area, clapping his hands sharply and listening to how the sound changed with each location. The echoes varied dramatically, sometimes crisp and clean, other times rich with harmonics that seemed to hang in the air like visible things. The thief understands this building not just visually, but musically, Holmes continued. His deductions building momentum like a stream gathering force as it rushes toward the sea. Each theft has been committed at a location with specific acoustic properties. The Egyptian display sits in an area where sounds are muffled, absorbed by the heavy stone pieces. The medieval manuscript case occupies a position where whispers can be heard clearly from great distances. And here, at the centre, we have the palace's natural amphitheatre, where even the smallest sound becomes amplified and transformed. The pattern became clearer as they examined the remaining crime scenes. The Greek mathematical instruments had been stolen from a gallery, where the iron framework created a series of geometric reflections that turned sound into complex patterns of echo and reverberation. The church bells had vanished from a space where the architecture seemed designed to amplify and purify sound, much like the nave of a cathedral. The Renaissance astrolabe had disappeared from an area where the glass walls created an acoustic lens that focused sound into precise, concentrated beams. And the Tibetan singing bowls had been taken from a meditation garden within the palace, where the combination of plants and water features created a space of perfect acoustic balance. Watson found himself nodding as the pattern became clear. So our thief is not just an art lover or an occult philosopher, but someone with a deep understanding of architecture and acoustics, someone who experiences this building as a complex musical instrument. Precisely, Holmes agreed, and in the gaslight his lean face seemed almost luminous with the joy of discovery. And if we are correct in this assumption, then we can predict where the next theft might occur. The thief is working through the palace systematically, mapping its acoustic properties, stealing objects that represent different types of sound or music. The bronze figurine, metal that rings when struck. The manuscript, paper that whispers when pages are turned. The music box, melody made mechanical. The mathematical instruments, the music of the spheres made tangible. The bells, voices calling across vast distances. The astrolabe, the silent music of planetary motion. The singing bowls, sound that exists in the space between striking and silence. They spent the next several hours exploring the palace with this new understanding. Holmes occasionally humming or speaking aloud to test how different areas responded to sound. The building revealed itself to be far more complex acoustically than either man had imagined. There were spaces where conversations could be conducted in perfect privacy, and others where the slightest whisper would carry throughout entire sections. Some areas seemed designed to amplify sound, while others absorbed it so completely that even footsteps became silent. In the Oriental collection, they discovered galleries where the arrangement of screens and sculptures created acoustic mazes, spaces where sound seemed to travel through impossible pathways before emerging in unexpected locations. The Roman section contained areas where the marble statuary created echo chambers that transformed simple words into complex harmonies. The Renaissance galleries held spaces where the interplay of paintings and sculpture with the building's iron framework created acoustic effects that seemed to give voice to the artwork itself. As they worked, the night deepened around them. Outside the glass walls, London settled into its nocturnal rhythms. The fog thickened, transforming the palace into an island of light floating in a sea of grey mist. The gas flames flickered more noticeably now, their light creating ever-shifting patterns on the interior surfaces. The building's iron framework continued its subtle song of expansion and contraction, a mechanical lullaby that seemed to rock the entire structure like a great cradle. It was during these explorations that Holmes made another crucial discovery. In several locations throughout the palace, he found evidence of recent modifications, small changes to the positioning of display cases, minor adjustments to the lighting fixtures, subtle alterations to the acoustic properties of various spaces. Someone had been systematically fine-tuning the building's acoustic characteristics, preparing it for some larger purpose. Watson, Holmes said as they paused in a gallery devoted to musical instruments from around the world, I believe we have been thinking about this case in too limited a fashion. These thefts are not the crime itself, but preparation for something far more ambitious. The musical instrument gallery was itself a marvel, containing examples of human musical expression from every culture and historical period. Ancient lyres stood beside modern pianos, tribal drums shared space with church organs, and wind instruments from every continent created a visual symphony that spoke to music's universal appeal. But here too, Holmes noticed the subtle modifications. Instruments positioned at precise angles, resonating chambers adjusted to create specific acoustic relationships with the building's structure. Preparation for what? Watson asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. A performance, Holmes replied. Our thief is not simply stealing objects. He is assembling an orchestra. Each stolen item represents a voice in some grand composition that will use the palace itself as its primary instrument. As if to confirm his theory, Holmes discovered in one of the quieter galleries a collection of papers that had been left behind, apparently by accident. The papers contained what appeared to be architectural drawings of the palace, but with musical notation overlaid on the structural diagrams. Acoustic measurements filled the margins, and complex mathematical formulas suggested calculations related to the movement of sound through the building's vast spaces. The drawings revealed the palace as Holmes had never seen it before, not as a static structure, but as a dynamic system capable of producing and modulating sound in ways that its original designers had never imagined. The thief had mapped every acoustic property of the building, identified every resonant frequency, calculated the precise positions where different types of sounds would create the maximum effect. He means to turn the entire palace into a musical instrument, Watson breathed, studying the diagrams with growing amazement. But for what purpose? Holmes examined the papers more closely, his trained eye picking out details that might escape a less experienced observer. The musical notation was not written in any conventional system, but used symbols that seemed to combine Western musical theory with elements borrowed from other traditions: Indian ragas, Chinese pentatonic scales, Arabic maqams, and theoretical systems that Holmes could not immediately identify. But more intriguing than the notation itself were the calculations that surrounded it. Mathematical formulas that seemed to relate musical intervals to architectural proportions, equations that suggested connections between acoustic resonance and human consciousness, diagrams that implied the possibility of using sound to influence not just emotion, but perception itself. I believe, Holmes said slowly, that our thief is attempting something that has never been tried before, to create a form of music that exists not as performance, but as architecture itself, to transform the palace into a composition that visitors would experience not by listening, but by moving through space. The implications were staggering. If successful, such an experiment would represent a completely new art form, something that combined music, architecture, and human psychology in ways that had never been attempted. The stolen objects would serve as components in this vast instrument, their individual voices contributing to a symphony that would encompass the entire building. As they continued their exploration, Holmes and Watson began to understand the true scope of their opponent's vision. The thief was not merely a criminal, but an artist and inventor whose ambitions transcended conventional categories. He had seen possibilities in the Crystal Palace that no one else had recognized, and was systematically working to bring those possibilities to life. In the natural history section, they found evidence that the thief had been experimenting with the acoustic properties of different materials. Mineral specimens had been repositioned to create specific resonant frequencies, fossils arranged to form acoustic lenses. Even the preserved specimens in their glass cases had been adjusted to create subtle changes in how sound moved through the space. The picture that emerged was of someone who understood the palace, not as a collection of separate galleries and exhibitions, but as a single, unified instrument of extraordinary complexity. Every surface, every object, every architectural detail had been evaluated for its acoustic potential and incorporated into an overall design that was breathtaking in its ambition. It was past midnight when Holmes finally called a halt to their initial exploration. They had identified dozens of locations where acoustic modifications had been made, mapped the probable connections between the various stolen objects and their intended functions in the thief's grand design, and gained a sense of the palace as something far more complex and purposeful than either had previously imagined. But more than facts and theories, they had gained something harder to quantify, a sense of the palace as a living entity, a creature of glass and iron that breathed with the rhythms of the city around it. They had begun to hear its voice, to understand the language it spoke, and to appreciate the vision of someone who had seen in this temple, to human achievement, the potential for an entirely new form of artistic expression. As they prepared to leave, Holmes paused at the main entrance, turning back for one final look at the mysterious structure that had become their stage. In the gaslight and shadow, the palace seemed almost ethereal, as if it might dissolve into dream at any moment. The countless reflections in its glass surfaces created the illusion of infinite depth, as if the building extended not just through physical space, but through dimensions of possibility that existed beyond ordinary perception. "Tomorrow night, Watson," Holmes said softly, his words creating small clouds of vapour in the cooling air. "We shall return, but not as investigators seeking to solve a mystery that has already occurred. We shall come as audiences to a performance that has yet to begin." Watson pulled his coat closer around his shoulders, feeling the autumn chill seep through the fabric. "You believe the thief will attempt his performance tomorrow?" "I believe," Holmes replied, his grey eyes reflecting the palace's amber light, "that what we have witnessed so far has been merely the preparation, the tuning of the instrument, if you will. Tomorrow night, when the moon is dark and the city sleeps most deeply, our mysterious composer will attempt to play the grandest composition ever conceived." As they walked away through the fog-shrouded streets, their footsteps echoing off the cobblestones in a rhythm that seemed to mirror the mechanical heartbeat of the palace behind them, neither man spoke of the strange sense of anticipation that had settled over them like a comfortable blanket. They were no longer simply pursuing a criminal, but had become part of something larger, more complex. A puzzle that existed not just in the realm of logic and deduction, but in the spaces between sound and silence, between the solid reality of iron and glass, and the infinite possibilities that dwelt in the Victorian night. The following day passed with unusual slowness, as if time itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the evening's revelations. Holmes spent the morning in his study, poring over books on acoustics and architectural theory, trying to understand the technical aspects of what the thief was attempting. Watson, meanwhile, paid a visit to the British Museum, consulting with experts on ancient musical systems and the relationship between sound and consciousness in various cultures. Their research revealed that the thief's vision, while unprecedented in scope, was not entirely without historical precedent. Ancient civilizations had understood the power of acoustic architecture. The Greeks had built theatres with perfect acoustics. The Romans had created amphitheatres that could carry a whisper to the farthest seats, and many sacred sites around the world had been designed to enhance and focus sound for religious purposes. But no one had ever attempted to transform an entire building into a musical instrument capable of performing compositions of such complexity. The mathematical calculations alone represented years of careful study. The acoustic measurements would have required access to the building at all hours, and the artistic vision necessary to conceive such a project suggested a mind of extraordinary creativity and determination. As evening approached, Holmes and Watson made their way back to the Crystal Palace with a sense of anticipation that was almost electric. The fog was thicker tonight, rolling in from the Thames like a grey ocean that swallowed buildings and landmarks, transforming London into a city of shadows and suggestions. The palace emerged from this mist like a ship of light, its iron framework glowing warmly in the gaslight, its glass walls creating patterns of illumination that seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm. Pemberton met them at the entrance, his nervousness even more pronounced than it had been the night before. "There's something different tonight, Mr. Holmes," he whispered as he unlocked the great doors. "I can feel it in the air. like the building itself is waiting for something to happen. Inside, the palace seemed transformed. The familiar exhibitions and displays were all in their proper places, but the building felt different, more alive, more purposeful. The acoustic modifications that Holmes had identified the previous night were no longer subtle adjustments, but seemed to have reached some kind of critical mass, transforming the entire structure into something that vibrated with potential energy. They had not been inside for more than a few minutes when the first sound reached them. Not a noise exactly, but a presence in the air that seemed to exist just at the edge of hearing. It was like the memory of music, a whisper of melody that suggested rather than stated, that existed more in the imagination than in the physical world. Holmes stopped walking, his head tilted as he tried to identify the source of the sound, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the building itself were beginning to sing with a voice so low and subtle that it required absolute stillness to perceive. "Do you hear that, Watson?" Holmes asked softly. Watson strained his ears, trying to catch whatever had captured his friend's attention. For a moment, he heard nothing but the usual nighttime sounds of the palace, the settling of metal, the whisper of wind through the framework. But then, gradually, he became aware of something else, a presence in the air that was felt as much as heard. "It's beginning," Holmes said, and in his voice was a mixture of excitement and something that might have been awe. As they moved deeper into the palace, the sense of impending performance grew stronger. The stolen objects, Holmes realized, had been returned, not to their original locations, but to new positions throughout the building, where they could serve their intended purpose as components in the vast musical instrument that the palace had become. The bronze figurine of Thurth now stood in a position where it could catch and reflect sound waves in precise patterns, its metallic surface acting as an acoustic mirror that shaped the flow of vibrations through the Egyptian gallery. The medieval manuscript had been opened to a specific page and positioned where the rustling of its ancient parchment would add a whispered counterpoint to the building's emerging song. The music box sat in the exact centre of the great dome, its mechanical melody ready to provide a human-scaled anchor for the vast architectural symphony beginning to unfold around it. The Greek mathematical instruments had been arranged in geometric patterns that transformed them into a three-dimensional musical notation, their bronze surfaces gleaming in the gaslight like notes waiting to be played. The church bells hung suspended from the iron framework at precisely calculated intervals, ready to ring out harmonies that would resonate through the building's metallic skeleton. The Renaissance astrolabe occupied a position where its intricate brass workings could catch and modulate the acoustic energy flowing through the space, while the Tibetan singing bowls had been placed in locations where their ancient bronze voices could add depth and resonance to the overall composition. But these were not simply returned stolen goods. They had been integrated into a system of extraordinary complexity and beauty. Holmes could see now that each object occupied a position that was both acoustically and aesthetically perfect, contributing not only to the sound but to the visual harmony of the space. The thief had created something that was simultaneously a musical composition, an architectural installation, and a work of visual art. As they continued their exploration, the subtle music in the air began to grow stronger, more defined. It was not a melody in any conventional sense, but something that seemed to emerge from the very structure of the building itself. The iron framework sang with a deep, resonant tone that formed the base foundation of the composition. The glass walls caught and reflected higher frequencies, creating shimmering harmonics that danced around the central theme like light on water. The stolen objects added their own voices to this architectural chorus. The bronze figurine rang out occasional bell-like notes when the building's vibrations reached the proper frequency. The music box contributed its mechanical melody at precisely timed intervals, its sweet, nostalgic tune providing moments of human warmth within the larger, more abstract composition. The mathematical instruments created complex geometric patterns of sound that seemed to make visible the mathematical relationships underlying all music. But it was more than just the combination of these elements that made the experience so remarkable. Holmes realized that the thief had somehow managed to tune the entire building to specific frequencies that resonated not just with the ear, but with something deeper in human consciousness. The music seemed to bypass the usual pathways of perception and speak directly to the soul, creating emotions and sensations that had no names in any earthly language. Watson found himself deeply moved by the experience, though he could not have explained exactly why. The music, if it could be called music, seemed to touch something fundamental in his nature, awakening memories that were not quite memories, feelings that existed below the threshold of normal awareness. It was as if the building had found a way to give voice to the ineffable longings and aspirations that dwelt in every human heart. Extraordinary, Holmes breathed, his usual analytical detachment replaced by something approaching reverence. He has created something that transcends the boundaries between art and science, between architecture and music, between the physical and the metaphysical. As they moved through the various galleries, they began to understand the full scope of what the thief had accomplished. Each section of the palace contributed its own voice to the overall composition, but in ways that revealed an understanding of acoustic principles that seemed almost supernatural in its sophistication. In the Egyptian collection, the heavy stone sarcophagi and statuary created deep, resonant bass notes that spoke of ancient mysteries and eternal truths. The positioning of each object had been calculated to create specific acoustic relationships, so that sound moved through the space in patterns that evoked the flow of the Nile, the whisper of desert winds, the eternal rhythm of day and night in the land of the pharaohs. The Greek and Roman galleries sang with the clear mathematical precision of classical civilization. The marble statuary had been arranged to create acoustic ratios that corresponded to the mathematical principles underlying ancient theories of harmony. Sound moved through these spaces with the logical beauty of a geometric proof, creating melodies that seemed to embody the classical ideals of order, proportion, and rational beauty. The medieval section breathed with the mysterious harmonies of plain song and the deeper rhythms of faith and devotion. The arrangement of illuminated manuscripts, religious artifacts, and architectural fragments created acoustic spaces that evoked the interior of a great cathedral, where every whisper carried the weight of centuries of prayer and contemplation. The Renaissance galleries sparkled with the complex polyphony of a more sophisticated age, where multiple melodic lines wove together in patterns of extraordinary intricacy. The positioning of paintings, sculptures, and scientific instruments created acoustic relationships that mirrored the intellectual complexity of the period, when art and science, faith and reason, began their eternal dance of mutual influence and creative tension. The Oriental collections brought their own exotic harmonies to the composition, with acoustic arrangements that reflected the musical traditions of distant cultures. The singing bowls provided moments of transcendent clarity, their pure tones cutting through the more complex harmonies like shafts of sunlight penetrating morning mist. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the way these different cultural voices had been woven together into a unified whole. The thief had found a musical language that could encompass and harmonize the diverse expressions of human creativity represented in the palace's collections. Greek rationality sang in harmony with Egyptian mystery, medieval faith found common ground with Renaissance humanism, and Oriental wisdom added its voice to the cosmic chorus. As the night progressed, the composition continued to evolve and develop. Holmes realized that the thief had programmed the building to perform not a static piece, but a dynamic composition that would change and develop over the course of several hours. The acoustic modifications he had made included mechanisms that would alter the building's resonant properties as the temperature changed, as the glass expanded and contracted, as the very breathing of the building shifted with the passage of time. The result was a musical experience unlike anything that had ever been attempted before. The audience, Holmes and Watson, were not passive listeners, but active participants in the performance. Their movement through the space changed the acoustic relationships. Their breathing affected the air pressure, their very presence altered the way sound moved through the building. They discovered areas where standing in specific positions would cause the music to focus and intensify, creating moments of almost overwhelming beauty. They found corridors where walking at particular speeds would cause their footsteps to join the composition as percussion elements. They located galleries where the music seemed to respond to their emotional states, becoming more complex and intricate when they were intellectually engaged, more simple and direct when they allowed themselves to simply experience the beauty of the moment in one particularly magical area of the palace. Near a display of medieval musical instruments, they discovered that humming or singing would cause the building itself to respond, adding harmonies and counter-melodies that transformed their simple human voices into something approaching the music of the spheres. It was as if the palace had become a vast echo chamber for the human soul, amplifying and beautifying every expression of the musical impulse. But as beautiful as the experience was, Holmes could not entirely forget that they were dealing with a criminal who had stolen valuable artifacts and trespassed on private property. The artistic vision was extraordinary. The execution was brilliant, but the methods were still illegal. He found himself caught between admiration for the thief's genius and his duty as a consulting detective to see that justice was done. It was as they stood in the central dome, surrounded by the full glory of the architectural symphony, that they finally encountered the composer himself. He appeared not dramatically or suddenly, but with the same subtle presence that had characterized his entire project, materializing from the shadows as if he had always been there, waiting for them to notice his presence. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, tall and lean, with the pallor of someone who spent most of his time indoors. His hair was dark and touched with grey at the temples. His eyes held the intense, slightly otherworldly gaze of the true visionary. He was dressed simply but elegantly, in clothing that suggested artistic sensibilities rather than criminal intent. In his hands he carried a small baton, not the stick used by a conductor, but something more delicate, more precise, a tool for fine adjustments to his vast instrument. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice carrying easily through the acoustic space despite being barely above a whisper. "I wondered when you would arrive. I am Professor Adrian Cadence, and I welcome you to my greatest composition." Holmes stepped forward, his detective's instincts warring with his growing appreciation for what Cadence had accomplished. "Professor Cadence, I must inform you that you are under suspicion for the theft of valuable artifacts from this institution. However, I cannot deny that what you've created here is remarkable." Cadence smiled, an expression that held both sadness and profound satisfaction. "I expected no less from the great Sherlock Holmes. Yes, I am guilty of theft, though I prefer to think of it as temporary relocation. Every object I borrowed has been returned, and returned to positions where they can fulfill purposes far greater than mere display." Watson found his voice, though the beauty of the surrounding music made it difficult to focus on practical concerns. "But Professor, surely you understand that your methods, however artistic your intentions, constitute criminal activity?" "Indeed," Cadence replied, his voice carrying a note of melancholy that seemed to blend seamlessly with the building's song. "And I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions, but I ask only that you allow the composition to complete itself. It has taken me 7 years to prepare for this performance, and it will never be possible again. The acoustic modifications I have made are temporary. By tomorrow morning the building will return to its ordinary state, and this music will exist only in memory." Holmes found himself faced with an unprecedented dilemma. By law, he should arrest Cadence immediately and put an end to the unauthorized performance. But the artistic achievement represented here was so extraordinary, so unique, that its destruction would constitute a loss to human culture that could never be recovered. "Tell me," Holmes said finally, "how did you conceive such a project? What led you to see possibilities in this building that no one else had recognized?" Cadence's eyes took on a distant look, as if he were seeing beyond the immediate reality to some vision that existed only in his imagination. "I am a composer by training, Mr. Holmes, but I have spent my life frustrated by the limitations of conventional music. Even the greatest symphony orchestra can produce only a fraction of the sounds that exist in the natural world. But when I first entered this palace, I heard its voice, not with my ears, but with something deeper. I realized that there was an instrument of unprecedented range and power, capable of producing music that could encompass all of human experience. As if to illustrate his point, Cadence made a subtle gesture with his baton, and the building's song shifted into a new key, a different mode that seemed to evoke not just sound, but colour, texture, even scent. The stolen artifacts responded to his direction, each adding its voice to a harmony that grew more complex and beautiful with each passing moment. The theft was necessary, Cadence continued, his voice filled with the passion of the true artist. These objects needed to be positioned with mathematical precision to achieve the proper acoustic relationships. I could not have obtained permission for such an experiment. Who would have believed that it was possible? But I could not let the vision die merely because it challenged conventional thinking. Holmes listened to this explanation with growing fascination. He recognized in Cadence something of his own passion for pushing beyond the boundaries of conventional thought, his own willingness to pursue truth regardless of social conventions. The professor's methods were questionable, but his dedication to his art was absolute. "And after tonight?" Holmes asked. "What becomes of your composition then?" Cadence's smile held a note of infinite sadness. "After tonight it exists only in memory. The acoustic modifications I've made will fade as the building returns to its normal state. The objects will be returned to their proper places, and I will face whatever consequences my actions have earned." Watson stepped forward, moved by the professor's obvious sincerity and the beauty of what he had created. Surely there must be some way to preserve this achievement, to allow others to experience what we have witnessed tonight. "Perhaps," Cadence replied, "but that is a problem for another day. Tonight there is only music." For the next several hours, Holmes and Watson allowed themselves to become completely absorbed in the extraordinary performance unfolding around them. They followed Cadence through the various sections of the palace as he conducted his vast orchestra, making subtle adjustments here and there, guiding the composition through movements that seemed to represent different aspects of human experience. The opening movement had been about creation itself, the birth of consciousness, the first stirring of artistic impulse, the moment when intelligence became aware of beauty. The music seemed to recapitulate the entire history of human cultural development, from the first cave paintings to the most sophisticated achievements of civilization. The second movement explored the relationship between individual and community, the tension between personal expression and social harmony. The stolen objects sang of their origins, the Egyptian figurine of divine wisdom, the Greek instruments of rational analysis, the medieval manuscript of spiritual seeking, the Renaissance astrolabe of scientific inquiry. But their individual voices were woven into a collective tapestry that suggested the essential unity underlying all human endeavour. The third movement was the most complex, dealing with the paradoxes and contradictions that make human existence both tragic and beautiful. The music moved through passages of almost unbearable sadness, moments when the weight of mortality and limitation seemed to crush the spirit, followed by soaring flights of hope and transcendence that suggested the possibility of meaning beyond the merely physical. As dawn approached, the composition moved toward its conclusion. The final movement was about acceptance, the peaceful acknowledgement of human limitations combined with gratitude for the brief privilege of consciousness, creativity, and connection. The music gradually simplified, the complex polyphony resolving into harmonies of crystalline purity, until finally only a single, sustained note remained, hanging in the air like a question that required no answer. In the silence that followed, Holmes found himself profoundly moved by what he had experienced. It had been more than a musical performance. It had been a glimpse into the deepest mysteries of human existence, a revelation of possibilities that most people never imagined could exist. "Professor Cadence," Holmes said finally, his voice hushed with something approaching reverence, "I have experienced many remarkable things in my career, but nothing that approaches what you have accomplished here tonight." Cadence bowed slightly, the gesture of an artist acknowledging appreciation from a peer. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. That means more to me than you can know." But even as he spoke, the building around them was already beginning to return to its ordinary state. The acoustic modifications that had transformed it into a musical instrument were designed to be temporary, and now they were gradually fading as the metal cooled and contracted, as the glass panels settled back into their normal positions, as the stolen objects returned to silence. Watson looked around at the familiar galleries and exhibitions, now appearing exactly as they always had, and found it difficult to believe that just moments before they had been part of an experience that transcended the boundaries of ordinary reality. "Professor," Holmes said, "I find myself in an unusual position. By law, I should place you under arrest for the theft of these artifacts, but I cannot bring myself to treat as a common criminal someone who has given the world such an extraordinary gift." Cadence nodded understanding. "I expected no less from you, Mr. Holmes. I am prepared to face the legal consequences of my actions, but I ask only that you remember what we experienced here tonight, and perhaps find some way to ensure that others might someday have similar opportunities to experience the marriage of art and science, of beauty and knowledge." In the end, Holmes chose a solution that honoured both the law and the artistic achievement he had witnessed. Cadence was indeed arrested and charged with theft, but Holmes's testimony at the trial focused not on the criminal aspects of the case, but on the extraordinary artistic and scientific achievement that the professor had accomplished. The result was a sentence that required Cadence to work with the palace's administrators to develop legal ways of conducting acoustic experiments within the building. Several universities expressed interest in studying his techniques, and within a few years the field of architectural acoustics had been revolutionized by applications of his discoveries. The stolen objects were returned to their proper places, but not unchanged by their experience. Visitors to the palace often reported that certain areas of the building seemed to possess unusual acoustic properties, and that sometimes, on very quiet nights, when the fog rolled in from the Thames and the building settled into its nocturnal rhythms, they could almost hear the echo of music that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Holmes and Watson never spoke publicly about the details of what they had experienced that night, but it remained one of their most treasured memories. In later years, when the pressures of their detective work became particularly intense, they would sometimes visit the palace and stand in the great dome, listening for echoes of the extraordinary music that had once transformed an entire building into a symphony. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the conditions were exactly right, and they listened with the proper combination of attention and imagination, they could still hear it, that whisper of sound that existed at the intersection of architecture and music, of human creativity and cosmic harmony, of the possible and the actual. The case of the Phantom Thief of the Crystal Palace became one of Holmes's most unusual investigations, one that challenged his understanding not just of criminal behaviour, but of the boundaries between crime and art, between individual expression and social responsibility, between the practical demands of law and the transcendent call of beauty. Years later, when asked about the most remarkable case of his career, Holmes would sometimes speak of Professor Adrian Cadence and his architectural symphony. He would describe the way an entire building had been transformed into a musical instrument, the way stolen artifacts had been given voices in a composition that encompassed all of human experience, and the way a single night's music had revealed possibilities that most people never dreamed could exist. But perhaps most importantly, the case had taught Holmes something about the nature of genius itself, that it often exists at the margins of conventional thinking, that it sometimes requires unconventional methods to achieve extraordinary results, and that the greatest achievements in human culture often come from those who are willing to risk everything in pursuit of visions that others cannot even see. The Crystal Palace still stands, its iron framework still gleaming in the London light, its glass walls still reflecting the changing moods of the sky. Visitors come to see its exhibitions and admire its architecture, unaware that they are walking through the remains of perhaps the greatest musical composition ever attempted. But sometimes, on very quiet nights, when the fog rolls in from the Thames and the city sleeps deeply, those who know how to listen can still hear it, the whisper of music that exists in the space between sound and silence, between the physical and the metaphysical, between what is and what might be. It is the ghost of Professor Cadence's symphony, still echoing through the iron and glass, still singing its song of human possibility and transcendent beauty. And in that music, for those who have ears to hear it, lies a message that transcends the boundaries of any single case or investigation, a reminder that the greatest mysteries are not always those that can be solved through logic and deduction, but those that can only be experienced through openness to wonder, through willingness to believe that reality contains more possibilities than we normally allow ourselves to imagine. The fog swirls around the palace's glowing walls, the night wind whispers through its iron framework, and somewhere in the vast spaces between sound and silence, the music continues to play, patient and eternal, waiting for those who are ready to hear its extraordinary message of beauty, possibility, and transcendent human achievement. Sleep now, and perhaps in your dreams you too will hear the whisper of that architectural symphony, the echo of music that transforms buildings into instruments, and stolen objects into voices in a cosmic chorus that sings of all the wonders that human creativity can achieve when it dares to imagine beyond the boundaries of the ordinary world. The Crystal Palace sleeps in the London night, dreaming its dreams of music and light, holding its secrets close, waiting for the next visitor who might be ready to hear its extraordinary song. In the weeks that followed their extraordinary night at the Crystal Palace, Holmes found himself unable to shake the memory of Professor Cadence's architectural symphony. The experience had opened doorways in his mind that he hadn't known existed, revealing connections between art and science, between logic and intuition, that challenged his fundamental understanding of how the world operated. Watson, too, was profoundly affected by what they had witnessed. As a man of medicine, he was accustomed to dealing with the measurable, the quantifiable, the physically real. But the music that had emerged from the palace's iron and glass structure had touched something in him that existed beyond the reach of scientific instruments, something that spoke to the deepest mysteries of human consciousness and the inexplicable longings that dwelt in every human heart. The legal proceedings that followed Cadence's arrest were unlike anything the London courts had ever seen. The professor's lawyer argued that what his client had done transcended ordinary categories of crime and punishment, that the temporary borrowing of artifacts to create an unprecedented work of art should be judged by different standards than common theft. The prosecution countered that the law made no exceptions for artistic motivation, that property rights could not be suspended simply because someone claimed to have a vision. Holmes's testimony proved to be the decisive factor in the case. Standing before a courtroom packed with journalists, scientists, artists, and curious members of the public, he described in careful detail what he and Watson had experienced that night. His words painted a picture of achievement so extraordinary that even the most skeptical listeners found themselves questioning whether conventional legal categories were adequate to address what Professor Cadence had accomplished. "Your Honour," Holmes concluded his testimony, "I have spent my career in pursuit of truth, believing that logic and reason were sufficient tools for understanding any mystery the world might present. But what Professor Cadence created in the Crystal Palace that night revealed truths that exist beyond the reach of ordinary reasoning. He showed us that a building could become a musical instrument, that stolen objects could find voices they never possessed in their display cases, that the boundaries between different forms of human expression are far more fluid than we normally imagine." The courtroom was silent as Holmes paused, choosing his words with the precision that had made him famous throughout London. "I do not condone theft, Your Honour, but neither can I condemn as criminal the actions of a man who gave us a glimpse of possibilities that most of us never dreamed could exist." Professor Cadence's methods were unorthodox, even illegal, but his achievement represents a contribution to human culture that transcends the value of any individual artifact. The judge, a man named Sir Reginald Thornbury, who was known for his strict interpretation of the law, found himself faced with an unprecedented dilemma. The evidence of theft was clear and undeniable, but the circumstances surrounding that theft were so extraordinary that they seemed to demand a response that went beyond simple punishment. In the end, Sir Reginald crafted a sentence that acknowledged both the criminal nature of Cadence's actions and the extraordinary value of what he had accomplished. The professor was sentenced to 2 years of supervised research, during which he would work with the Crystal Palace's administrators, leading universities, and the Royal Society to develop legal frameworks for conducting acoustic experiments within historic buildings. The sentence also required Cadence to document his techniques and theories, ensuring that his discoveries would be preserved for future generations of researchers and artists. Within months of the trial's conclusion, his work had sparked a revolution in the field of architectural acoustics, inspiring new approaches to building design that took sound into account as a fundamental element of spatial experience. But perhaps more importantly, the case had opened up entirely new conversations about the relationship between art and science, between individual creativity and social responsibility, between the preservation of cultural artifacts and their potential for ongoing creative use. Museums around the world began to experiment with new forms of exhibition that allowed visitors to experience historical objects not just visually, but through multiple senses, creating immersive environments that brought the past to life in unprecedented ways. Holmes and Watson continued to visit the Crystal Palace regularly during the months following the trial, drawn by their memories of that extraordinary night and their curiosity about how Cadence's ongoing work was developing. They watched as the professor, working now with official permission and substantial funding, began to implement more permanent acoustic modifications to the building. The changes were subtle but profound. Carefully positioned resonating chambers were built into the structure, hidden within the existing architecture so that visitors would never know they were there unless they understood what to listen for. Specialized materials were introduced into key locations, substances that could enhance or modulate sound in ways that seemed almost magical to those unfamiliar with the science behind them. The result was a building that retained all its original grandeur and educational value, while gaining new capabilities that transformed the visitor experience in ways that were both subtle and revolutionary. Those who came to see the exhibitions found themselves lingering longer than they had planned, sensing something indefinable in the atmosphere that made the artifacts seem more alive, more connected to the living present. Children were particularly responsive to these changes. Groups of school children who toured the palace after Cadence's modifications often reported experiences that their teachers struggled to understand. Moments when the Egyptian mummies seemed to whisper stories of ancient kingdoms, when the Greek sculptures appeared to move with the rhythm of marble breathing, when the medieval manuscripts rustled with sounds that might have been the voices of long-dead monks still chanting their prayers. Adults, too, found their visits changed by the professor's acoustic innovations, though they were often less willing to acknowledge experiences that challenged their rational understanding of how the world operated. But even the most skeptical visitors frequently reported feeling unusually moved by certain exhibits, experiencing emotions that seemed disproportionate to what they were actually seeing, sensing connections between historical periods and cultures that they couldn't quite articulate. Holmes, with his characteristic attention to detail, began to document these responses, interviewing visitors and cataloguing their experiences. What emerged from his research was a picture of human consciousness that was far more complex and mysterious than most people realized. The professor's acoustic modifications seemed to access layers of perception that existed below the threshold of ordinary awareness, creating resonances that spoke directly to the unconscious mind. It's as if he's found a way to make visible the invisible connections that exist between all forms of human expression, Holmes explained to Watson one evening as they sat in their Baker Street lodgings, reviewing the day's interviews. The music that emerges from the building doesn't just sound beautiful. It reveals the mathematical relationships underlying all art, the emotional patterns that connect poetry to painting to sculpture to music. Watson nodded, though he found himself struggling to put into words his own growing understanding of what Cadence had achieved. As a medical man, he was familiar with the ways that physical stimuli could affect mental states, but what they were observing at the palace seemed to operate according to principles that existed beyond current scientific understanding. "I keep thinking about the children," Watson said, staring into the firelight that danced in their hearth. "They seem to respond to the modifications without any of the intellectual resistance that adults bring to the experience. It's as if they can hear frequencies that we've trained ourselves to ignore." This observation led Holmes to propose an experiment that would further illuminate the nature of Cadence's achievement. With the professor's cooperation and the palace administrator's permission, They arrange for a series of carefully controlled visits by groups of people with different backgrounds and levels of sensitivity to acoustic phenomena. Musicians, as expected, showed heightened responses to the building's modifications, often reporting that they could perceive complex harmonic relationships that seemed to exist in the architecture itself. But surprisingly, mathematicians showed equally strong responses, describing experiences where numerical relationships seemed to become visible as patterns of light and shadow, where abstract equations took on aesthetic dimensions that they had never recognized before. Artists and poets reported the most dramatic experiences of all, often emerging from their visits in states of creative excitement that lasted for days or even weeks. Many described receiving inspiration for new works that seemed to come not from their own conscious minds, but from some deeper source that the palace's acoustic properties had somehow made accessible. But perhaps most intriguing were the responses of individuals who claimed to have no particular sensitivity to music or art. Many of these visitors, after spending time in the modified areas of the palace, reported subtle but persistent changes in their perception of the world around them. Colours seemed more vivid, sounds more nuanced. Even ordinary conversations took on new layers of meaning that they had never noticed before. These effects, Holmes realised, suggested that Professor Cadence had discovered something far more significant than a new form of musical expression. He had found a way to enhance human perceptual capabilities, to awaken dormant sensitivities that most people carried within them without ever knowing they existed. The implications were staggering. If acoustic modifications to architectural spaces could enhance human consciousness in measurable ways, then the professor's work represented not just an artistic achievement, but a breakthrough in understanding the relationship between environment and awareness that could revolutionize fields from education to medicine to psychology. Word of these discoveries began to spread throughout the scientific and artistic communities of Europe and beyond. Researchers from universities across the continent made pilgrimages to London to study Cadence's techniques. Architects began incorporating acoustic considerations into their designs in ways that had never been attempted before. Musicians started composing works specifically intended to interact with architectural spaces, creating new forms of environmental music that existed at the intersection of sound and space. But it was the educational applications that proved most transformative. Schools that implemented acoustic modifications based on Cadence's principles reported dramatic improvements in student engagement and learning outcomes. Children who had struggled with traditional educational approaches suddenly found themselves able to absorb and retain information with unprecedented ease. The modifications seemed to create learning environments that spoke to multiple types of intelligence simultaneously, allowing students to process information not just intellectually, but through their entire sensory apparatus. Mathematical concepts became musical patterns, historical events took on narrative rhythms that made them easier to remember, scientific principles revealed aesthetic dimensions that made them more compelling and comprehensible. Watson, drawing on his medical background, began to investigate the physiological mechanisms that might explain these effects. Working with researchers at several London hospitals, he conducted studies that revealed measurable changes in brain activity among individuals who spent time in acoustically modified environments. The patterns that emerged from these studies suggested that certain combinations of frequencies and architectural forms could induce states of consciousness that were characterized by increased connectivity between different regions of the brain. Areas that normally operated independently, the logical and intuitive, the analytical and creative, the verbal and spatial, began to work together in ways that dramatically enhanced cognitive capabilities. It's as if the acoustic modifications create a kind of neural symphony, Watson explained to Holmes after reviewing the latest research results. Different frequencies seem to activate different brain regions, but in patterns that encourage them to harmonize rather than compete with each other. This discovery led to new applications of Cadence's principles in therapeutic settings. Hospitals began experimenting with acoustic modifications to patient rooms, finding that certain combinations of architectural forms and resonant frequencies could accelerate healing processes in ways that traditional medicine couldn't explain but couldn't deny. Mental health facilities reported particularly dramatic results. patients suffering from depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions showed marked improvements when treated in acoustically modified environments. The modifications seemed to create states of consciousness that were naturally more balanced, more integrated, more capable of accessing inner resources for healing and growth. Holmes, meanwhile, found that his own detective work was being influenced by his growing understanding of acoustic principles. He began to pay attention to the sound environments in which crimes were committed, recognizing that the acoustic properties of different spaces could provide valuable clues about the psychological states of both criminals and victims. He developed new investigative techniques based on his observations at the Crystal Palace, learning to read the acoustic signatures of different locations and to understand how environmental factors might influence human behavior in ways that had never been considered before. In one particularly memorable case, Holmes was able to solve a seemingly impossible murder by recognizing that the acoustic properties of the victim's study had created a psychological environment that encouraged obsessive behavior. The killer, a business partner who had been driven to desperation by financial pressures, had become fixated on the victim while working in that space, ultimately acting on impulses that might never have developed in a different acoustic environment. But it was not just the practical applications of Cadence's discoveries that continued to fascinate Holmes and Watson. It was the deeper philosophical implications of what the professor had revealed about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to the physical world. The experience at the Crystal Palace had shown them that the boundaries between self and environment, between individual awareness and collective consciousness, were far more permeable than most people realized. The building's acoustic modifications had created a space where visitors could experience directly the interconnectedness that mystics and philosophers had long claimed existed between all forms of life and consciousness. This understanding began to influence how Holmes approached not just his detective work, but his entire relationship with the world around him. He found himself more sensitive to the subtle environmental factors that influenced human behavior, more aware of the ways that physical spaces could enhance or diminish human potential. Watson, too, discovered that his medical practice was being transformed by insights gained from their ongoing observations at the palace. He began to pay attention to the acoustic and spatial qualities of his treatment environments, making modifications that seemed to enhance his patients' capacity for healing in ways that conventional medicine had never recognized. Years passed, and the Crystal Palace continued to serve as a laboratory for exploring the frontiers of human consciousness and environmental design. Professor Cadence, working now with official recognition and support, pushed his discoveries into new territories, creating acoustic installations that seemed to exist at the very edge of what was physically possible. He developed techniques for creating three-dimensional sound sculptures that existed only when listeners moved through space in specific patterns. He designed acoustic environments that could induce states of consciousness similar to meditation or prayer, but without requiring any particular religious or philosophical beliefs. He created spaces where groups of people could experience forms of collective awareness that seemed to transcend individual limitations while enhancing rather than diminishing personal identity. Each new development brought fresh insights into the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to environmental factors. The palace became a pilgrimage site for researchers, artists, spiritual seekers, and anyone interested in exploring the outer reaches of human potential. But perhaps most importantly, the ongoing work at the Crystal Palace demonstrated that the boundaries between art and science, between aesthetic experience and practical application, between individual creativity and collective benefit, were artificial constructions that limited human understanding and achievement. Holmes and Watson, now recognized as leading authorities on the intersection of environmental design and human consciousness, continued to make regular visits to the palace throughout their later years. They watched as Cadence's work inspired new generations of researchers and artists, each building on his discoveries to push human understanding into previously unimaginable territories. On quiet evenings, when the palace was closed to the general public and they had special permission to wander through its acoustically modified galleries, they would sometimes encounter experiences that reminded them of that first extraordinary night when they had witnessed the birth of an entirely new form of artistic expression. The stolen objects, long since returned to their proper places, seemed to retain some memory of their brief transformation into components of an architectural symphony. Visitors often reported that certain artifacts appeared more alive, more connected to their historical contexts, more capable of communicating across the centuries that separated them from their original creators. The bronze figurine of Thoth still stood in the Egyptian collection, but those who spent time studying it often reported feeling as if the ancient god of wisdom were somehow present, offering insights into mysteries that had been forgotten for millennia. The medieval manuscript still rested in its case among other illuminated texts, but scholars who examined it found themselves understanding alchemical principles that had puzzled researchers for centuries. The music box had been returned to its place in the mechanical arts collection, but its melody now seemed to carry echoes of the vast architectural symphony it had once helped to create. Children who heard it often reported dreams of flying through crystal palaces, of hearing music that came not from instruments, but from the buildings themselves, of understanding secrets that they couldn't quite remember upon waking. Holmes, in his later writings about the case, reflected on the profound changes that their encounter with Professor Cadence had brought to his understanding of the world and his place within it. The experience had shown him that reality contained dimensions of possibility that could only be accessed through a willingness to question fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness, creativity, and human potential. We live in a world that is far stranger and more wonderful than most of us allow ourselves to imagine, he wrote in his private journals. The case of the Crystal Palace taught me that the greatest mysteries are not those that can be solved through logic and deduction alone, but those that require us to expand our very conception of what it means to be conscious, creative, and alive. Watson, in his own memoirs of the case, emphasized the medical and therapeutic implications of what they had discovered. The palace had shown him that healing was not just a matter of treating symptoms or correcting physical malfunctions, but of creating environments that supported the full expression of human potential. The professor's acoustic modifications demonstrated that consciousness itself could be enhanced through environmental design, Watson wrote. This discovery opened up entirely new approaches to medicine and healing that focused not just on fixing what was broken, but on awakening capabilities that most people never knew they possessed. As the years passed and both Holmes and Watson entered their final decades, they continued to visit the Crystal Palace regularly, drawn by memories of that extraordinary night and by ongoing curiosity about the frontiers of human consciousness that Professor Cadence's work continued to explore. On their last visit together, when both men were well into their 70s, and the palace had become a testament to decades of acoustic research and environmental design, they stood once again in the great dome where they had first heard the building sing with its own voice. The space around them hummed with subtle energies that seemed to connect past and future, individual awareness and collective consciousness, the rational and the mystical. Visitors moved through the galleries with expressions of wonder and recognition, experiencing connections to history and culture that seemed to transcend the normal limitations of time and space. "Do you hear it still?" Watson asked quietly, listening to the almost inaudible music that seemed to emerge from the very structure of the building itself. Holmes closed his eyes, tilting his head as he had done so many years before when first encountering Professor Cadence's architectural symphony. The sounds were different now, more subtle, more integrated, more sophisticated, but the essential magic remained unchanged. "I hear it," Holmes replied, his voice soft with memory and gratitude. The song of possibility, the music of consciousness exploring its own infinite potential. It never really stopped, Watson. We just learned how to listen. As the sun set over London and the palace began its transformation into the luminous dream structure that it became each evening, the two old friends stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the whispered conversations of visitors who were discovering for themselves the extraordinary possibilities that dwelt within the marriage of art and science, environment and consciousness, human creativity and cosmic harmony. The fog began to roll in from the Thames, softening the palace's iron framework into flowing lines of light and shadow. The glass walls became mirrors for the evening sky, creating reflections that seem to extend into infinite dimensions of possibility. And somewhere in the vast spaces between sound and silence, between the physical and the metaphysical, the music continued to play, patient and eternal, waiting for each new generation of listeners who might be ready to hear its extraordinary message of human potential and transcendent beauty. Professor Cadence's great composition had become more than a single night's performance. It had evolved into a living testament to the power of human imagination to transcend conventional boundaries and create new realities that enhanced rather than diminished the full spectrum of human experience. And in that ongoing music, that eternal symphony of consciousness exploring its own infinite creativity, lay a message that would continue to inspire and transform all who encountered it. That the greatest achievements in human culture come not from following established rules, but from having the courage to imagine new possibilities and the dedication to bring those possibilities to life, regardless of the obstacles that conventional thinking might place in the path. The Crystal Palace slept in the London night, dreaming its dreams of music and light, holding its secrets close, preparing for another day of revelation and wonder. But the story of Professor Cadence and his extraordinary vision was far from over. In the months and years that followed that transformative night, the ripples of his achievement spread outward like waves from a stone dropped into still water, touching lives and inspiring discoveries that would reshape humanity's understanding of consciousness, creativity, and the hidden potentials that dwelt within the marriage of environment and awareness. Holmes found himself increasingly drawn into the scientific community that had formed around Cadence's work. The Royal Society, initially sceptical of claims about acoustic architecture and consciousness enhancement, gradually became convinced by the mounting evidence of measurable effects. Distinguished physicists, mathematicians, and philosophers gathered regularly at the palace to witness demonstrations and participate in experiments that pushed the boundaries of accepted knowledge. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, one of London's first female physicians and a pioneer in the emerging field of psychology, became particularly interested in the therapeutic applications of acoustic environmental design. Working closely with Watson, she established a research clinic where patients suffering from various forms of mental and emotional distress could experience treatment in acoustically modified spaces. The results were nothing short of revolutionary. Patients who had shown no improvement under conventional treatment methods often experienced rapid progress when exposed to carefully designed acoustic environments. Depression seemed to lift like fog before sunrise. Anxiety dissolved into states of calm alertness, and chronic pain conditions improved in ways that traditional medicine struggled to explain. It's as if the acoustic modifications create a kind of neural reset, Dr. Thornfield explained to Holmes during one of their regular consultations. The brain seems to remember patterns of healthy functioning that it had forgotten, as if the environmental changes remind consciousness of its own natural capacity for balance and healing. These discoveries attracted attention from medical professionals across Europe and beyond. Delegations of doctors, researchers and healers made the journey to London to study the techniques being developed at the palace and the associated research facilities. Many returned to their home countries with plans to implement similar programs, creating a network of acoustically enhanced healing environments that spanned the civilized world. But it was perhaps in the realm of education that Professor Cadence's discoveries had their most profound and lasting impact. The acoustic modifications that had been implemented in various schools throughout London were producing results that challenged fundamental assumptions about how human beings learned and processed information. Children who had been labelled as slow learners or academically challenged often bloomed in acoustically enhanced classrooms, demonstrating capabilities that their teachers had never suspected. Students who had struggled with mathematics suddenly found themselves able to perceive numerical relationships as musical patterns, making complex calculations with an ease that seemed almost intuitive. Language learning, too, was transformed by acoustic environmental design. Foreign languages seemed to become more accessible when taught in spaces that had been tuned to enhance the brain's natural pattern recognition capabilities. Students reported that new vocabularies and grammatical structures seemed to organize themselves naturally in their minds, as if the acoustic modifications helped create neural pathways that made language acquisition effortless. Holmes began to see connections between these educational discoveries and his own detective work. He realized that many of the insights he had gained over the years, his ability to perceive patterns that others missed, his capacity for making logical leaps that seemed to transcend ordinary reasoning, might be enhanced by spending time in acoustically modified environments. Working with Professor Cadence, he began experimenting with acoustic conditions that might optimize the mental states necessary for complex problem solving. They discovered that certain combinations of frequencies and architectural forms could induce states of consciousness characterized by enhanced pattern recognition, improved memory recall, and increased creative thinking. These discoveries led Holmes to modify his own study at Baker Street, incorporating subtle acoustic enhancements that seemed to amplify his natural detective abilities. Watson noticed that his friend's already remarkable powers of observation and deduction seemed to reach new levels of precision and insight. "It's extraordinary," Watson confided to Dr. Thornfield during one of their collaborative research sessions. "Holmes was always brilliant, but the acoustic modifications seem to have unlocked capabilities that even he didn't know he possessed. His ability to perceive connections between seemingly unrelated facts has become almost supernatural in its accuracy." The success of these individual applications led to larger-scale experiments in environmental design. Entire neighborhoods began to incorporate acoustic principles into their planning, creating residential areas where the arrangement of buildings, gardens, and public spaces naturally enhanced the well-being and cognitive capabilities of the inhabitants. The effects were subtle but profound. Crime rates dropped in acoustically optimized neighborhoods, not through any direct intervention, but because residents seemed naturally inclined toward more cooperative and harmonious behavior. Educational achievement improved, artistic expression flourished, and community bonds strengthened in ways that traditional urban planning had never achieved. These developments attracted the attention of progressive thinkers from around the world. Visionaries and reformers saw in Professor Cadence's work the potential for creating entirely new forms of human society, communities designed not just for physical comfort and economic efficiency, but for the optimal development of human consciousness and creative potential. Plans were drawn up for experimental communities that would incorporate acoustic environmental design as a fundamental organizing principle. These would be places where the very architecture would support human flourishing, where the built environment would serve not just as shelter, but as an instrument for enhancing every aspect of human experience. The first of these experimental communities was established in the countryside outside London, on land donated by a wealthy philanthropist who had been profoundly moved by his experiences at the Crystal Palace. The village of Harmondale, as it came to be known, was designed as a living laboratory for exploring the possibilities of consciousness-enhancing environmental design. Every aspect of Harmondale's construction incorporated acoustic principles discovered through Professor Cadence's research. The placement of buildings, the design of public spaces, even the routing of walking paths were all calculated to create optimal acoustic conditions for human flourishing. The results exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Residents of Harmondale reported levels of happiness, creativity, and overall life satisfaction that seemed almost too good to be true. Children growing up in the community displayed exceptional learning abilities and emotional intelligence. Adults found themselves more productive, more creative, more capable of forming deep and meaningful relationships. Holmes and Watson became regular visitors to Harmondale, studying the community's development and documenting the ways that environmental design influenced human behavior and consciousness. Their observations contributed to a growing body of knowledge about the relationship between physical space and mental states that would influence architecture and urban planning for generations to come. But perhaps most remarkably, the residents of Harmondale began to develop what could only be described as enhanced perceptual abilities. Living in an environment that had been acoustically optimized seemed to awaken dormant sensitivities that allowed them to perceive subtle patterns and connections that escaped ordinary observation. Some residents reported being able to sense the emotional states of others with unusual accuracy, as if the acoustic environment somehow amplified their natural empathic abilities. Others discovered that they could perceive mathematical relationships in nature, the Fibonacci spirals in flower petals, the harmonic ratios in bird songs, the geometric patterns underlying cloud formations, with a clarity that seemed almost mystical. These developments raised profound questions about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to environmental factors. If acoustic modifications to living spaces could enhance perceptual abilities to such a degree, what other hidden potentials might be awakened through environmental design? Professor Cadence, now recognized as one of the leading pioneers in the emerging field of consciousness-environment interaction, began to explore even more ambitious possibilities. Working with architects, musicians, mathematicians, and consciousness researchers from around the world, he developed plans for what he called consciousness cathedrals, structures specifically designed to induce expanded states of awareness and facilitate exploration of the furthest reaches of human potential. The first consciousness cathedral was built in a remote valley in Scotland, funded by a consortium of universities and research institutions that recognised the revolutionary implications of Cadence's work. The structure defied conventional architectural categories, combining elements of sacred geometry, advanced acoustic engineering, and artistic vision into something that seemed to exist at the intersection of science and mysticism. Visitors to the Consciousness Cathedral reported experiences that challenged the boundaries of ordinary awareness. Many described states of consciousness characterized by a profound sense of interconnectedness with all life, by access to knowledge and insights that seemed to come from beyond individual understanding, by experiences of beauty and meaning that transcended anything they had previously imagined possible. These reports attracted the attention of philosophers, theologians, and spiritual teachers from various traditions around the world. Many recognized in the Consciousness Cathedral the technological fulfillment of ancient dreams about sacred spaces that could facilitate direct experience of transcendent realities. Holmes, despite his reputation for rational skepticism, found himself profoundly moved by his visits to the Consciousness Cathedral. The experiences he had there seemed to confirm his growing understanding that reality contained dimensions of possibility that conventional thinking had barely begun to explore. "I have spent my life believing that logic and observation were sufficient tools for understanding any mystery the world might present," he told Watson, after one particularly transformative visit to the cathedral. "But this structure has shown me that consciousness itself is the greatest mystery of all, and that our normal waking awareness represents only a tiny fraction of our actual capabilities." Watson, drawing on his medical background, worked with researchers to study the physiological effects of exposure to the Consciousness Cathedral's acoustically enhanced environment. Brain imaging studies revealed patterns of neural activity that had never been documented before, states of consciousness characterized by unprecedented levels of integration between different brain regions, by access to cognitive capabilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. These discoveries led to new therapeutic applications that pushed the boundaries of what medicine had previously thought possible. Patients suffering from severe mental illness often experienced rapid and lasting improvements after spending time in consciousness-enhancing environments. Conditions that had been considered incurable, certain forms of autism, treatment-resistant depression, chronic anxiety disorders, began to respond to acoustic environmental therapies in ways that traditional medicine struggled to explain. The implications extended far beyond medicine into fields such as education, creativity enhancement, and even spiritual development. Universities began to incorporate consciousness-enhancing environmental design into their campuses, creating learning environments that naturally optimize students' cognitive capabilities. Artists and musicians found that working in acoustically enhanced spaces seemed to give them access to sources of inspiration that they had never tapped before. Composers created works of unprecedented complexity and beauty. Painters discovered new visual languages that seemed to capture previously inexpressible aspects of human experience. And writers produced literature that spoke to readers with unusual directness and emotional power. Even in the realm of scientific research, consciousness-enhancing environments began to produce remarkable results. researchers working in acoustically optimized laboratories reported breakthrough insights that seemed to come not from logical analysis alone, but from a more integrated form of understanding that combined rational thought with intuitive perception. The mathematical discoveries that emerged from these enhanced research environments were particularly striking. Scientists began to perceive relationships and patterns in natural phenomena that had previously been invisible, leading to new theories about the fundamental structure of reality that challenged conventional understanding of physics, chemistry, and biology. Professor Cadence, now in his 60s and recognised as one of the most important innovators of his generation, continued to push the boundaries of what was possible through environmental consciousness enhancement. His latest project involved the creation of what he called reality gardens, outdoor spaces where the principles of acoustic environmental design were applied to natural landscapes. These reality gardens combined carefully positioned natural elements, rocks, water features, vegetation, with subtle acoustic modifications to create outdoor environments that enhance perception and awareness in ways similar to the indoor consciousness-enhancing spaces that had already proven so effective. Visitors to the reality gardens often reported experiences of profound connection with the natural world, as if the acoustic modifications somehow removed the barriers that normally separated human consciousness from the larger web of life of which it was a part. Many described feeling as if they could perceive the life force flowing through plants and trees, as if they could sense the intelligence that operated within natural ecosystems. These experiences led to new approaches to environmental conservation and ecological understanding. Researchers began to recognize that the relationship between human consciousness and the natural world was far more intimate and reciprocal than had previously been understood. The reality gardens became pilgrimage sites for people seeking deeper understanding of their place within the natural order. Environmental activists found that spending time in these enhanced natural spaces gave them new insights into the interconnectedness of all life and renewed motivation for protecting the planet's ecological systems. Holmes and Watson, now both in their final years, continue to make regular visits to the various consciousness-enhancing environments that had grown out of Professor Cadence's original discovery at the Crystal Palace. They marvelled at how a single night's experience had blossomed into a worldwide movement that was transforming human understanding of consciousness, creativity, and potential. On what would prove to be their final visit together to the Crystal Palace, now recognised as the birthplace of consciousness environment research, they stood once again in the Great Dome where they had first witnessed the building's transformation into a musical instrument. The space around them hummed with energies that seemed to connect not just past and future, but the individual consciousness of every visitor with some larger intelligence that transcended personal boundaries. The stolen artefacts that had once been components in Professor Cadence's architectural symphony had long since been returned to their cases, but they seemed to retain some memory of their brief transformation, radiating presence and meaning that touched everyone who encountered them. "Do you ever wonder," Watson asked quietly, "what other possibilities remain hidden in the world around us, waiting for someone with vision enough to perceive them and courage enough to bring them to life?" Holmes, his hair now white but his eyes still sharp with intelligence and curiosity, gazed up at the iron framework that soared above their heads. "I think," he said slowly, "that Professor Cadence showed us something far more important than how to make buildings sing. He showed us that reality itself is far more creative and responsive than we normally allow ourselves to imagine." The evening light filtered through the palace's glass walls, creating patterns of illumination that seemed to dance with their own inner music. Visitors moved through the galleries with expressions of wonder and recognition. Their consciousness expanded by environmental modifications that had become so subtle and sophisticated that they seemed like natural features of the space itself. "The greatest mystery," Holmes continued, "is not any particular crime or puzzle that might be solved through clever deduction. The greatest mystery is consciousness itself, this inexplicable capacity we have for awareness, for creativity, for experiencing beauty and meaning and connection." Professor Cadence found a way to enhance that capacity through environmental design, but the real discovery was that consciousness and environment are not separate things at all. They are part of a single, integrated system that is constantly creating and recreating itself. As the sun set over London and the palace began its nightly transformation into a luminous temple of possibility, the two old friends stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the whispered conversations of visitors who were discovering for themselves the extraordinary potentials that dwelt within the marriage of consciousness and environment. The fog began to roll in from the Thames, softening the palace's iron framework into flowing lines of light and shadow. The glass walls became mirrors for the evening sky, creating reflections that seemed to extend into infinite dimensions of possibility. And somewhere in the vast spaces between sound and silence, between the individual and the universal, the music continued to play, not just in the Crystal Palace, but in consciousness cathedrals and reality gardens and acoustically enhanced communities around the world. Professor Cadence's great composition had become more than a single night's performance, more than a revolutionary approach to architecture and environmental design. It had evolved into a living demonstration of consciousness, exploring its own infinite creativity, of human potential, awakening to possibilities that previous generations had never dared to imagine. The movement that had grown from that first extraordinary theft continued to spread, inspiring new generations of researchers, artists, and visionaries who understood that the boundaries between self and world, between consciousness and environment, between the possible and the actual, were far more fluid than conventional thinking supposed. In schools around the world, children learned in environments that naturally enhanced their cognitive abilities and creative expression. In hospitals, patients healed in spaces that supported their body's natural capacity for recovery and renewal. In communities designed according to consciousness-enhancing principles, people lived together with levels of harmony and cooperation that previous social arrangements had never achieved. And in the quiet moments of dawn and dusk, when the world paused between day and night and consciousness touched its own deeper sources, those who had learned to listen could hear it still. The whispered music of infinite possibility, the eternal symphony of awareness exploring its own unlimited potential. The Crystal Palace dreamed on through the London night, its iron framework humming with frequencies that spoke directly to the human soul, its glass walls reflecting not just the physical world but the endless dimensions of consciousness itself. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new discoveries, new possibilities for human flourishing and creative expression. And in that ongoing revelation, in that eternal exploration of what it means to be conscious and creative and alive, Professor Cadence's legacy continued to unfold, not as a finished achievement, but as an invitation to endless discovery, an encouragement to imagine and create realities that enhanced rather than diminished the full spectrum of human potential. Sleep now, and let your dreams carry you into those luminous spaces where consciousness and environment dance together in perfect harmony, where the music of possibility plays on, forever awakening new potentials, forever revealing new wonders, forever singing the song of what human beings might become when they learn to live in conscious partnership with the creative intelligence that underlies all existence. The night embraces all possibilities, and in the gentle darkness, new dreams are always being born. In the years that followed Holmes and Watson's final visit to the Crystal Palace, the legacy of Professor Cadence's extraordinary vision continued to unfold in ways that even he had never imagined. The world had been transformed by the understanding that consciousness and environment were not separate phenomena, but aspects of a single, integrated reality that could be consciously shaped and enhanced through careful attention to the subtle relationships between space, sound, and awareness. The children who had grown up in acoustically enhanced environments began to reach adulthood, and they brought with them capabilities that seemed almost magical to those who had been raised in conventional settings. These young people possessed natural abilities to perceive patterns and connections that previous generations had struggled to recognize. They move through the world with an intuitive understanding of the interconnectedness of all things, able to sense the emotional states of others, to perceive the mathematical harmonies underlying natural phenomena, to access creative inspirations that seem to flow from some inexhaustible source. Universities around the world began to recruit these acoustically enhanced individuals, recognizing that they represented a new form of human potential that could revolutionize every field of human endeavor. In the sciences, they made breakthrough discoveries that had eluded researchers for centuries. In the arts, they created works of unprecedented beauty and meaning. In social and political spheres, they demonstrated natural abilities for conflict resolution and collaborative problem-solving that offered hope for humanity's most persistent challenges. Dr. Emily Cadence, the professor's daughter, had inherited not only her father's genius for acoustic environmental design, but had expanded his vision into realms that touched the very foundations of human existence. Working with architects, consciousness researchers, and spiritual teachers from traditions around the world, she began to develop what she called evolutionary environments, spaces specifically designed to accelerate human development and facilitate the emergence of new forms of consciousness. These evolutionary environments incorporated not just acoustic modifications, but integrated approaches that included color therapy, geometric design, electromagnetic field manipulation, and even the subtle use of plant essences and mineral frequencies. The result was environmental design that seemed to speak directly to the deepest levels of human consciousness, awakening potentials that had remained dormant for generations. The first evolutionary environment was constructed in a remote valley in New Zealand, far from the distractions of industrial civilization. The structure itself defied conventional architectural categories, seeming to grow from the landscape like a natural formation, while incorporating sophisticated technologies that enhanced consciousness in ways that seemed miraculous to those unfamiliar with the science behind them. Visitors to this evolutionary environment often reported experiences that challenged their fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human. Many described states of consciousness characterized by direct perception of the unity underlying all existence, by access to knowledge and wisdom that seemed to transcend individual learning, by experiences of love and compassion that encompassed not just other humans, but all forms of life. These reports attracted attention from spiritual teachers and consciousness researchers around the world, many of whom recognized in Emily Cadence's work the technological fulfillment of ancient prophecies about humanity's evolutionary destiny. The evolutionary environments seemed to offer a bridge between the material and spiritual dimensions of existence, providing scientifically reproducible methods for accessing states of consciousness that mystics and sages had described for millennia. Word of these developments reached the aging Sherlock Holmes, now in his 80s and spending his final years in peaceful retirement in the countryside outside London. Though his body had grown frail, his mind remained as sharp as ever, and he followed the unfolding implications of Professor Cadence's original discovery with the same intense curiosity that had driven his detective work throughout his life. When an invitation arrived for him to visit the New Zealand evolutionary environment, Holmes knew that he was being offered one final opportunity to explore the frontiers of human consciousness and potential. Despite his advanced age and the arduous journey that would be required, he felt compelled to accept, sensing that this experience might provide answers to questions that had been forming in his mind since that first extraordinary night at the Crystal Palace decades earlier. Watson, now also in his 80s and Holmes's companion through a lifetime of adventures and discoveries, insisted on accompanying his old friend on what they both understood might be their final journey together. The voyage to New Zealand became a pilgrimage of sorts, a gradual transition from the familiar world of Victorian London to a realm of possibilities that seemed to exist at the very edge of human understanding. The evolutionary environment, when they finally encountered it, exceeded even Holmes's considerable expectations. The structure seemed to pulse with living energy, its surfaces shifting subtly in response to the consciousness of those who approached it. The very air around the building seemed charged with potential, as if reality itself had become more flexible, more responsive to intention and awareness. Inside the evolutionary environment, Holmes and Watson found themselves in spaces that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could normally perceive. Corridors that appeared straight from one angle revealed themselves as spirals when viewed from different perspectives. Rooms that seemed small and intimate suddenly opened into vast chambers that contained what appeared to be entire landscapes, complete with flowing water, growing plants, and skies that shifted through colours that had no names in any earthly language. But more remarkable than the visual impossibilities were the effects on consciousness itself. Within minutes of entering the environment, both men found their awareness expanding in ways that seemed both natural and miraculous. The analytical mind that had served Holmes so well throughout his detective career remained sharp and clear, but it was now integrated with forms of intuitive understanding that allowed him to perceive reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously. Watson discovered that his medical training took on new dimensions within the evolutionary environment. He could perceive the energy fields that surrounded and interpenetrated the human body, could sense the flow of life force through subtle channels that conventional anatomy had never recognized, could understand illness and healing as processes that involved not just physical mechanisms, but the entire spectrum of human consciousness. For 3 days and nights, Holmes and Watson remained within the evolutionary environment, experiencing states of consciousness that revealed the true scope of human potential. They communicated with each other, not just through words, but through direct transmission of thoughts and feelings. They experienced memories that seemed to belong not to their individual lives, but to the collective memory of humanity itself. They accessed knowledge about the nature of reality that seemed to come not from books or teachers, but from direct perception of the fundamental patterns underlying all existence. On their final night in the evolutionary environment, as they sat together in a chamber that seemed to contain the entire cosmos within its walls, Holmes turned to his oldest friend with eyes that sparkled with the wonder of ultimate discovery. "Watson," he said softly, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the structure around them, "I have spent my life solving mysteries, believing that there was always a logical explanation for every puzzle the world might present. But what we have experienced here shows us that the greatest mystery of all is not something to be solved, but something to be lived." Watson nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for further words. They had reached the end of their long journey of discovery together, and they had found something more precious than any treasure, more satisfying than the solution to any crime. They had found direct experience of the truth that had been hinted at in Professor Cadence's architectural symphony all those years ago, that consciousness itself was the fundamental reality, that human beings were not separate individuals struggling in an indifferent universe, but expressions of a cosmic intelligence that was constantly creating and exploring itself through infinite forms. As dawn broke over the New Zealand landscape, painting the sky in colours that seemed to sing with their own inner light, Holmes and Watson prepared to leave the evolutionary environment and return to the ordinary world. But they carried with them now an understanding that would transform their remaining years, a knowledge that consciousness was not confined to individual bodies or minds, but was the very fabric of existence itself. Their journey back to London became a gentle transition, a gradual return to consensus reality that allowed them to integrate the extraordinary experiences they had shared. They spoke little during the long voyage home, but communicated through glances and silences that carried more meaning than volumes of words. In their final months together, Holmes and Watson lived with the quiet satisfaction of those who had completed their life's work and discovered its ultimate meaning. They spent their days in peaceful contemplation, often sitting together in Holmes's garden, listening to the songs of birds and the whisper of wind through leaves, perceiving in these simple sounds echoes of the cosmic symphony they had glimpsed in the evolutionary environment. When Watson passed peacefully in his sleep one quiet autumn evening, Holmes felt no sorrow, only gratitude for the privilege of having shared such an extraordinary journey of discovery with his dearest friend. He understood now that consciousness was eternal, that what they had shared could never be lost, only transformed into new forms of expression and experience. Holmes himself followed his friend into the greater mystery just before Christmas, surrounded by the gentle presences of those who had learned to perceive the continuity of consciousness beyond the boundaries of individual existence. His final words whispered to Emily Cadence, who had come to visit him in his last days, were, "Tell them that the music never stops playing, it only changes keys." The legacy of Professor Adrian Cadence, his extraordinary architectural symphony, and the revolution in human consciousness that it had sparked, continued to unfold long after its original creators had passed into legend. The Crystal Palace remained a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand the deeper mysteries of consciousness and environment, its iron and glass structure still humming with the subtle frequencies that spoke directly to the human soul. Around the world, evolutionary environments continued to multiply, each one unique in its design, but unified in its purpose of facilitating human development and the emergence of new forms of consciousness. The children and grandchildren of those who had been raised in acoustically enhanced environments began to display capabilities that previous generations would have considered superhuman: telepathic communication, direct perception of energy fields, the ability to heal through conscious intention, and access to knowledge and wisdom that seemed to flow from the very source of intelligence itself. Humanity stood at the threshold of a new evolutionary phase, one in which the boundaries between individual and collective consciousness, between matter and mind, between the possible and the actual, were dissolving into new forms of integrated awareness. The work that had begun with a mysterious theft at the Crystal Palace had blossomed into a global transformation that touched every aspect of human existence. And in the quiet hours of dawn and dusk, when the veils between dimensions grew thin and consciousness touched its own deeper sources, those who had learned to listen could still hear it, the eternal symphony of awareness exploring its own infinite creativity, the cosmic music that played through every atom and galaxy, every heartbeat and breath, every moment of wonder and discovery. The song of consciousness itself, forever creating new realities, forever awakening new possibilities, forever singing the eternal lullaby of existence itself into the peaceful embrace of infinite dreams. In this gentle twilight of understanding, where mystery and knowledge dance together in perfect harmony, the greatest adventure of all continues, the endless journey of consciousness discovering its own unlimited nature, one magical moment at a time, in the eternal now where all possibilities dwell in peaceful, infinite perfection. Sleep now, beloved dreamers, and let your consciousness join the cosmic symphony, where every dream is a note in the infinite composition of existence, and every moment of rest is a return to the source of all wonder, all beauty, all love. The music plays on forever and always in the crystal chambers of eternity. That's the end of our tale, dear listeners. Drop your thoughts, your city, your time zone, whether you're in Paris at dusk, Seoul in the dead of night, Sao Paulo before sunrise, or Istanbul under a silent moon. If this story gave you chills like the episode, subscribe for more shadows to come. Keep the candles burning, and until next time, sleep light.